I got my client to fill out a fitness testing questionnaire, and then based on the answers given to me in this questionnaire, I was able to devise a plan for my client to complete 6 tasks based on the answers given to me. The idea for these tests is to improve my client's current level of fitness, and these 6 tests that I gave to my client were the yo-yo test, the 35-meter sprint, vertical jump, press-up test, and the sit and reach test, and lastly, the 1 max rep test. The first out of the 6 tests I got my client to complete was the yo-yo test, and firstly we need to look at the suitability of the yo-yo test. So the yo-yo test evaluates an individual's ability to repeatedly perform whilst going through intervals over prolonged periods. And this is perfect for my client to do, because as a winger, my client won't be running all game. When their team is defending, my client will have the opportunity to rest, but once not defending and possibly on a counter-attack, my client must suddenly burst into action and cover distance on the pitch. This means that this test is designed perfectly for my client, because it will train their ability to cover a certain amount of distance after a period of resting and not being active, which is easily relatable to a game of football. The score my client received whilst doing this test was 760, which, as you can see, is very poor according to the normative data for the yo-yo test. This then brings me to question the reliability of the test. The reliability of this test was very poor. This then affected my client's performance because there was a lack of clarity when performing the test. Before the test was carried out, I explained to my client that they needed to complete this test, and my client was ready to perform the test with a good understanding of what they needed to do. However, before we started the test, there was a CD that had all the timings to complete the test, and before the test started, the CD went through its own protocol of the test. However, the CD explained the protocol in a different way, leaving my client very confused. Because of this confusion, my client massively underperformed and obtained a score that was way below average, which doesn't match other results my client achieved during the other 5 tests. Another thing that might have affected my client's results was the fact that they had done prior exercise about 15 minutes before completing this test. They had completed the 35-meter sprint test. I don't personally think that fatigue would have been much of an issue. However, maybe when comparing my client's results to a set of normative data, my client's results might have been higher if they hadn't have done this previous exercise and had done a better warm-up. Some other people might not have done a warm-up before carrying out this test, so there is a way in which this test could have been unreliable. My client was wearing appropriate clothes when performing this test, therefore this wouldn't have affected my client's reliability. And the time of day in which they completed this test was around midday, so I don't believe that time of day would have been an issue that would have affected my client's reliability. Overall, I feel as though the lack of clarity in the protocol is the main thing that has affected this test's reliability and therefore my client's result in the test. The second test I got my client to complete was the 35-meter sprint test. Again, first of all, we will look at the suitability of the test. My client, being a winger, will need to have the element of speed in their game to make them successful. Because of this, the second test that I recommended was the 35-meter sprint test. The purpose of this test is to determine acceleration and maximum running speed and their speed's endurance, depending on the distance they run. If my client can increase their speed, then they will be able to run past opponents on the field, which are what the wingers are designed to do. After completing the test, my client received a score of 5.03, which, as you can see when comparing to the normative data, is seen as a good score. Looking back on the reliability of this test, it was quite a good test. One of the reasons this is the case is because the distance of 35 meters was measured out correctly, which therefore is very beneficial when carrying out the test. My client was also wearing appropriate sports clothing whilst carrying out the test, which again helps the reliability. However, one thing that did affect the reliability of the test is the fact that my client wasn't happy with their first run. So they asked if they could do it again to see if they could beat their previous time. This would be a reliability issue, because then my client would have possibly slightly fatigued their muscles, which would then affect the outcome of their second run. So I was obligated to take the result from their first run. My client had done no prior exercise to this test, which they needed to use, where they needed to use their hamstrings or other vital leg muscles to great effect. So this wouldn't have affected my client's results. I did tell my client to warm up so that they would warm up the necessary muscles needed to get the best results in this test. However, I don't believe that this again would have fatigued my client's muscles needed to complete this test. The time I got my client to complete this test was around 12 p.m, so I don't feel as though the time of day can have much effect on the outcome of my client's results. The third test I got my client to complete was the vertical jump test. And again, like the previous two tests, first of all we're going to look at the suitability of the tests. So, my client mentioned to me that one of their weakest points in their game was winning the ball in the air. So I recommended that they try to do the vertical jump test to improve their maximum height that they can reach when jumping. The power vertical jump test is a test of a person's leg power and peak reach height. Therefore, by completing this test, my client will also improve their leg power, which will be helpful in improving other aspects of their game, such as speed. When completing the test, my client got a score of 55 centimeters, which, as you can see comparing to the normative data, is an above average score. However, this test has a few ways in which it could be unreliable. One way of this is that the scoring can be easily miscalculated, giving the client and therefore giving the client the wrong score. When measuring my client's score, I was particularly careful when measuring. However, it was very difficult to see where my client's peak height was on the board because already lots of marks were there from previous tests. So I lacked the clarity when measuring, which therefore could affect my client's results in this test and therefore also affect the reliability of the test. Another way this could be an unreliable test is the fact that my client had done previous exercise before doing this test. They had completed the yo-yo test, so fatigue would definitely be an issue affecting my client when they were completing this test. However, the time of day wouldn't have been an issue, neither would what my client was wearing, because it was appropriate sports clothing. However, I do believe if my client would have completed the vertical jump test before they had completed the yo-yo test, my client would have received a much better score because their muscles wouldn't have been as fatigued as they were. The fourth test I got my client to perform was the press-up test. And again, looking at the suitability first, the press-up test is designed to test a person's upper body strength and muscular endurance. And I feel as though if my client wants to improve their game, then it will be crucial to improve their upper body strength and muscular endurance. Playing on the wing, my client will need to hold off defenders that are likely to be more stronger than them. Therefore, by increasing their upper body strength, my client will not be able to be pushed off the ball as easily, which would greatly benefit them. My client received a score of 59 press-ups within a minute, which, as you can see when comparing to the normative data, is an excellent score. A disadvantage of doing this test is that people may use different techniques when doing a press-up, meaning that reliability is then put at risk. Also, people have done different warm-ups, and some may be more productive than others, maybe meaning that, again, the reliability is at risk. However, with my protocol, I told my client how to correctly perform a press-up, and they were able to successfully complete the test with the technique not being an issue. However, my client had done exercise prior to doing this test, but this exercise did not fatigue any of the muscles needed within this test, so their fatigue isn't an issue concerning the reliability of the test. My client was again wearing an appropriate sports clothing, which therefore again isn't a problem affecting the reliability, and the time of day was again around midday, so therefore again this wouldn't affect the reliability of the test. The fifth test I got my client to complete was the sit and reach test. Again, looking at suitability first, my client plays on the wing in a game of football, meaning that they must cover a lot of ground on the pitch. The sit and reach test is a test of a person's flexibility in their lower back and hamstrings. The testing of flexibility in my client's hamstrings will be vital. My client will need to have sufficient flexibility in their hamstrings to be successful on the wing. Because if their hamstrings are not flexible, then my client might hyperextend and injure themselves. and because of this lack of flexibility, it could have a massive effect on the length of my client's injury. I made my client perform this test so that they can train the flexibility in their hamstrings, however, train the flexibility in their lower backs, which would also be helpful when playing football. My client received a score of around 11 centimetres, which, as you can see comparing to normative data, is seen as a good score within the sit and reach test. The sit and reach test was the first out of the 6 tests I got my client to complete, and because of this, a warm-up might be an issue concerning the reliability of the test. I feel as though the warm-up my client completed was not beneficial to this test. The sit and reach test is designed to test the person's flexibility in their lower back and hamstrings, and I feel as though my client hadn't done a warm-up specifically targeting these places. Then if they had have done, I feel as though the outcome might have been a slightly higher result from the test. The lack in warm-up affected the reliability of the test. However, apart from this, there wasn't anything else that really affected the reliability of the test. My client was again wearing appropriate sports clothing. The test was completed around 10:30 AM, so timing wouldn't have been that much of an issue. Because of the lack of problems whilst performing the test, comparing my client's test to a set of normative data for this test, I feel as though by comparing this, the outcome is relatively accurate. The 6th test and final test I got my client to complete was the 1 rep max test. Again, looking at suitability first, this test should be done this test was done to improve my client's strength. My client told me that they believed that strength is an aspect needed when playing in their position in their particular sport. They also told me that they felt as though strength was an aspect that they needed to improve on. The 1 rep max test is designed to see how much weight a person can withstand within 1 repetition. And this was a good test to improve my client's strength. My client will see an improvement on the pitch if they improve their muscular endurance, because this will allow them to keep on playing without their muscles fatiguing as quickly. The score my client received after doing this test was a maximum weight of 35 kilograms. However, this isn't there's no way of being able to compare this to normative data, because the normative data that I received before setting this client to my test records the scores in a different way. So this would straight away affect the reliability of the testing. There are also other ways in which the reliability of this test might have been affected, because by having the right if you have the wrong technique whilst lifting these weights, then you can be putting yourself at serious risk of injury. So before the test is completed, before the test was completed, I explained to my client the correct way of lifting the weights. But whilst performing the test, I noticed that they weren't doing it in the way that I explained. So I got my client to repeat the test again. However, by doing this, my client would then have had fatigued muscles, which then could have affected the reliability and therefore the outcome of the testing. My client was originally using the momentum of lifting to help get a higher score, not doing what I explained to them, which is lifting it up to your waist and then slowly pulling it up towards your chest, which is the correct way to lift heavy weights. By doing this in the wrong way, my client was putting himself at serious risk of injury. Once I explained to my client the correct way to lift the weights, there wasn't any other problems. Again, the appropriate sports clothing was being worn at the time, and the time of day, again, isn't an issue concerning the reliability of the testing. This then brings me to the end of the 6 tests I got my client to complete.